Hi there and welcome to Mastering Hard Surface. For those that don't know anything about me, I've been a CGI artist for about 12 years now. I began my career as a modeler at Fuel International in Sydney, working on feature film and TVCs during the time when hard surface modeling was just starting to explode thanks to guys like Fausto Di Martini and Rene Garcia. This was a time before ZBrush or Mudbox was used in production, when studios demanded extremely high quality assets quickly and efficiently, but most importantly, these assets needed to be as low poly as possible due to the hardware at the time being significantly slower than it is today. At this time, modeling was my only passion, and I practiced literally every day for years, refining and speeding up my technique. During this time, edge extrusion modeling was quite unfamiliar to most artists, but it was the workflow I adopted thanks to the power of 3ds Max and the advanced tools it provided artists that were unmatched in other software packages at the time. So to this day, I still use the exact same method for modeling as when I started, and you will find as I go through this course that the old school technique is extremely clean and powerful, giving you the ability to model pretty much anything. So the idea behind this course stems back from before I made my hard surface essentials tutorial, but due to being exhausted at the time, and you can hear that in my voice, I was doing crazy hours and wasn't really happy at that point. I had no choice but to compress my knowledge into as small a video as possible. It wasn't really an ideal situation, but that tutorial helped a lot of people understand how powerful hard surface modeling inside 3ds Max can be. It didn't really cover everything though. It was basically just the start. Like it was giving you the technique and the right push in the correct direction, but it didn't actually show you how to use those techniques on advanced models. It didn't incorporate any real design theory or some of the more important things that are not only going to make you understand how to model, but how to model cool things. So it's been a few years now since creating that tutorial, and I finally feel like I have the confidence again to build a new course that takes a user not only through the fundamentals, but through all of the advanced techniques and design workflows required to produce characters, robots, props, and environments. So there's going to be a lot of content created throughout this course, but we're going to start with the basics. And in this lesson, I'm going to get you up to speed with the essential hotkeys, tools, and workflows that serve as a basis for pretty much all the models I create. So unfortunately, there is going to be a little bit of information rehashed from the Hard Surface Essentials tutorial, but I don't really have much of a choice because this course is designed to take users who've never used 3ds Max all the way through to being able to create complex models like you're seeing on the screen now. So the model you are seeing now is a work in progress I've been creating to get back my speed and technique, and it's the quality I expect from each and every student by the time the course is finished. I'll be working on this during my spare time to show you guys what is possible. And even though you're seeing a really complex and detailed mesh, the technique behind creating it is quite simple. So it's always using the exact same process for pretty much everything. If you break things down, it's quite simple. So everything is just broken down into a little piece, and what kind of builds it all together is that design theory, which I'll be teaching in a later lesson. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to configure 3ds Max to behave the same way it does for me when I'm modeling. A lot of you guys who are watching this course are already going to be quite familiar with modeling inside 3ds Max, and you're going to have your own hotkeys and your own interface configured. However, this is for the guys who have never modeled before, have only just installed the application, and need to know that very basic information on how to correctly configure things to work the best way possible. So the first thing you're going to be confronted with is this very white and gray interface, which is completely fine, but throughout my whole career I've always used the darker 3ds Max interface. So the first thing you want to do is you want to go to Customize, and you want to go to Custom UI and Default Switcher, and you want to swap it to AME Dark. So this should automatically load up this darker version of the interface, which is a lot easier on the eyes when you're modeling for hours on end. You don't want the interface to really be visible to you as you're modeling. You want all your focus to be on the viewport itself. So the next thing we need to do is we need to make sure that all our hotkeys are set up correctly. So how you do that is you go to Customize, Customize User Interface, and then in this dialog box that comes up, you'll see in the categories here, you've got all commands. So by default, we can find everything we're going to change. So I'm just going to load up the hotkeys I use on the screen now, and then I'll go through and swap those off for you just to show you how to do that. I know it's really basic, but there are guys who will never have touched 3ds Max before on the course, so I've got to run through this. So what you just saw is the basic hotkeys I use in the core of my workflow. It's not every single one for every single model, but it encompasses pretty much everything that I use on a day-to-day basis while modeling. So I'm going to run through, I'm going to set those hotkeys up, and then I can get started on showing you the basic premise for hard surface modeling. So to easily find the hotkey you want to change, just type in the first letter of it. So the first we're going to change is the orbital view mode. So you just type OR, go into hotkey, and assign that to S. Next is the cut tool. So you want to click back in here and just type cut, and you'll see that there's two different types. One's cut and one's cut for poly. You want to swap the poly one. So we're going to make that T. Next is target weld. Once again, you've got it for mesh, patch, and poly. We want to change it for poly, and we're going to make that Q. The coordinates menu, which is Alt and right click, you can see here we've got world, view, screen, parent, and local. I'll bring those up later, but first we're just going to finish assigning the hotkeys, the manual hotkeys. So we want to go to edge constraint, just type in edge, and you'll see that there's edge constraint toggle, and we're going to click this to see. The next thing we're going to do is replace the maximize viewport toggle, so we're going to set that to spacebar. What that'll do is now with spacebar I can swap between each viewport. Lastly, we're just going to change the show end result mode. So down here you want to go to the second one, and we're just going to assign this to tilde. It's the little wavy key you see right next to the 1 button on your keyboard. Okay, with that being done, now we've assigned all the hotkeys I use while modeling. The rest are just defaults. So things like Z, which you saw, that will just snap you to whatever you've got selected locally. So even at a sub-object level, you can hit Z and you'll zoom to wherever you have selected, or whatever is framed on screen if you don't have anything selected. So the next thing you want to know is what parts of the interface are most useful for you when you're modeling. 3ds Max is quite a complex application if you're doing things like animation, rendering, and rigging, but when it comes to modeling, you only need to really focus on a couple of areas of the interface to make everything happen. So you've got the toolbar on the right here, which is where you've got all your create tools, so you can create all your primitives. You can also edit those primitives using the tools available here. So when you start with a primitive, if you right click it, you want to convert it to an editable poly. This is what essentially will be editing for all models on the course. Everything's going to be converted into an editable poly object. If you've got a 24-inch monitor or a 1920 by 1080 display, you want to have more room for this toolbar on the right. So what you can do is you can select the little yellow line here and drag that in. I personally like to have 3 rows in the toolbar, but you should be able to get away with 2. So let me just delete these primitives, and what we're going to be using on the course to start out with and to get familiar with modeling inside Max is just a very simple plane object. So when you create the plane, in the geometry menu on the left here, on the right there, sorry, you'll see plane. Just create a plane, and then you're first encountered with the dimensions for it and the segments and things like that. So I'm just going to reduce the segments to 1, and I'm just going to make it an even number. And you can see there how we can just very quickly edit those dimensions. The next thing you want to be aware of is where things are in the in 3D space. So you want to know where your object is sitting. So when you create a new object, you want to make sure it's centered to 0. So what I like to do is, after I create an object, just to keep things simple, I go down into the coordinates menu here, and I just type in 0, I type tab, that will bring me to the next options box. I just go 0, 0, 0. So people have worked with me, they'll see me create an object, then I go down here and I'll just go like this. And you can hear on the keyboard input that I'm just going 0 tab, 0 tab, 0 tab. That will just center it very quickly. So now you've got an object at 0. But what's happened is 3ds Max has created it with a purple wireframe. So by default, Max will always create an object with a unique wireframe. You can disable that by ticking this Assign Random Colors button. But basically, you just want to make your wireframe black on your object. So what you do is, you go up here, you click that little colorful checkbox, and go black, and now all of a sudden your object becomes black. That's because when you create a new object, it's basing its diffuse color on the wireframe color you have selected. So you need to assign a new standard shader to display in the viewport. So to do that, you can hit the hotkey M, and that will bring up the material editor inside 3ds Max. And to create a new standard material, you can see these defaults we've got here. All you do is just click the standard button and then load it up again, and you've created your own custom shader. So you can create specular levels on that, you can adjust the diffuse value, and this will serve as the base shader for displaying our model. So you've got your wireframe set up correctly, you've got your geometry centered. Now you need to start familiarizing yourself with the editable poly object itself. So like I was saying, at the moment this object is still just a plain object, and basically every object is made up of vertices, edges, polygons, and the element itself, which is the whole object. So by default, 3ds Max gives you primitive options where I can adjust the length and width, but when we convert this to an editable poly, we're collapsing down those settings into its just raw form of vertices, edges, polygons, and the element itself. So what you want to do is you want to right click the plane and convert it to an editable poly object, and then you're confronted with all the tools that you are capable of adjusting the model with in this right hand toolbar. So a lot of people, what I see is they use the selection button here to swap between the sub-object selection modes. What I mean by that is that instead of clicking 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to select these sub-object modes, I see people go in and click it here, which is extremely slow. So you need to get used to using 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to change between your selection mode. So with 1, you can select the vertices. With 2, you can select edges. With 3, you can select the border. With 4, you can select the faces. And with 5, you can select the element. I'll demonstrate that by showing you here. If I have 2 polygons, when I select 1 polygon, it's only selecting that, but when I select the element, it selects the whole object itself. So once you get used to using 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to change between those sub-object modes, and if you're just starting out in Max and you're not doing that, you have to convince yourself to use these hotkeys, because you're going to be so slow when modeling. I've seen co-workers do it who've been modeling for years, and it's crazy. It's just simply crazy. So you need to get used to doing that. So the basic premise for my workflow is, and this is where I'm reiterating from the Hard Surface Essentials tutorial, is that the way I model is using edge extrusion. So basically, inside 3ds Max, you have the ability to start out with a plane, go to edge subobject mode, which is using 2, and if you hold down shift and drag, you can drag out new polygons from that edge. And it gives you the ability to very quickly block out objects and define what you want to do with your object. So what's kind of most important when you're doing this is that you've got 2 different ways in which you can drag out. And this is where you need to get used to the coordinate system in 3ds Max. So by default, you'll notice up here you've got this coordinate system and it's set to view. So that's giving you the option to use the X, Y, and Z axes to drag out where you want your polygons to go, as well as using this kind of multi-subobject mode where you can drag out in both directions. So you can drag out on the X and Z. So if you drag out on specific axes here, you hover over the axis you want to drag out from, and once it highlights yellow, you know you've got that locked off. So if you can see, if I hover over the blue, I've got that locked off. So you need to make sure you're not hovering over these main double selection methods, because then you're going to select both. And when you go to drag out, it's not going to move straight. So you can see here, if I've got the Z and the X selected, I can drag out left and right. But if I hover over just the blue, I can't do that anymore. So even though my mouse is moving to the right here, it's locking it off to that selection. Okay, so why do I have S selected for the arc rotate view mode, when by default you can use Alt and middle mouse to do the same thing? So right now I've got Alt and middle mouse selected, and I'm doing the exact same thing as if I had this arc rotate mode selected. Now the reason behind that is when you start modeling quickly and when you start modeling over a long period of time, you want to minimize the amount of use of pressing buttons. So when I'm holding down the middle mouse on this mouse, I've got a Logitech G9, I'm putting extra pressure on my finger that I don't need to. So if I'm modeling for 10 minutes, it's not going to make a difference. But if I'm modeling over 10 hours and I'm modeling non-stop, every time I go and select that middle mouse, it's fatiguing my finger. And you might be thinking that's a little bit extreme, like how bad can it get? Well, that's a very bad cause for RSI, using that middle mouse button to constantly add pressure to your finger. So what I like doing is, and I figured this out very early on, that it was much more efficient for me to click S and then let go of my left hand entirely, stretch it out. So even though I don't have a webcam at the moment, when I click S, usually what I'm doing is I'm clicking it so I'm giving my left hand a break. Because as I'm modeling, I've got all these hotkeys selected, and your hand becomes a little bit stiff, and it kind of you get stuck in a very static rhythm where you're not moving anything, you're not getting circulation to your fingers, you're not taking breaks. And so I've needed to make sure that I'm constantly relaxed and I'm constantly avoiding my fingers getting fatigued. Because once they are fatigued, and once you do feel that RSI feeling that anyone who hasn't modeled before will eventually feel, it's not very great, and it takes quite a while for your muscles to relax and get over that pain. I mean, I've seen co-workers work so hard that, I mean, I've done this myself, where you end up working with an ice pack under your wrist, and it's just ridiculous. So do whatever you can to avoid yourself becoming stiff while modeling. So when I click S, I've got the ability to use my right hand freely, and all I've got to do is just click down with the left button, which takes a lot less stress than the middle mouse button. So getting back to when I was talking about how you can extrude out edges to create new polygons, I don't always use the view axis mode, and that's because sometimes you've got geometry that's on a slightly different angle. Say if I've got like a a face that's coming out like this, and I don't want it to drag out straight like that because now the geometry's changed, what I can do is I can click Alt and right click, and that'll bring up a shortcut for the different axis view modes. It's the exact same as clicking up here, but when you click Alt and right click, your mouse is much closer to those settings. So I can be rotating around an object. If I've got it set to view mode, when I go to drag out there, sometimes I want to drag out with screen mode. And what screen mode will do is it changes the axis that you're dragging out with to be orientated to the screen. So say if I right click and I go to screen, you can see now I'm presented with a 2D gizmo. So I can drag out directly from the screen. And sometimes that's what you want while modeling. So I'll just go back. So like I was saying, if by default you're at view, sometimes you need to go Alt right click and quickly swap it to screen. I don't use parent or local or world really. It's really just between view and screen that you need to swap between. If you're not planning to work in screen mode for a long time, you've also got this little center gizmo here, which will do the same thing as working in screen mode, but it's a little bit faster. So when I swap to edge mode here and drag around, I can hold shift and drag from that center gizmo, and that will give you the ability to use screen mode there. A lot of the times I'm working in screen mode more than once, and this is a tiny little gizmo. It's a bit harder to see, so it's much quicker for me to use this bigger area than this small one. I like to make things easy for me when I'm selecting because I don't want to miss. And when you've got a little gizmo that's small, sometimes you miss it. You'll be working quickly, you'll be coming through, and you're sitting there and you click that accidentally, and then you miss it again, and it's frustrating. Whereas if you've got a bigger gizmo to work with, it's much easier. So how you can enable that is, if it's not enabled by default, go to Customize, Preferences, and go to Gizmos, and you'll see this center box handle. It'll say Move in Screen Space. So if I disable that,